Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah Allen, and I'll just let my other two teammates introduce themselves before we kick things off here.
I'm Raphael Lopoukhine, and Tim is actually not here, but our other member, Hannah Kim, is.
Hi, my name is Hannah Kim. I'll be sharing my screen while we run through the presentation, but I'll keep my camera off while I do that because my computer tends to struggle, so bear with me.
All right, so our synthesis map looks at expanding the use of innovative and underused solutions to create a more balanced housing market. The housing crisis has exposed a number of problems with our current economic, political, and social systems. We know that there aren't enough units available, and the ones that are being built tend to be developer and investor friendly rather than people friendly. So overall, the current system is lacking in innovation, and there's many barriers standing in the way of increasing options in the housing market. We also know from our research that people want to buy a property. This is in part because our rental system is so problematic, and also because of people's own deep drivers and motivations. So the map that we're going to look at tonight tells the story of the current housing market situation, why our housing system keeps building in the same old way, the actors and processes that create barriers to innovation, and how and why the value of homeownership is being reinforced. So the first part of the map here has some data showing a little bit about the current housing market in the GTA. In 2015, you can see from this graph that there was a major rise in population of people that were looking to buy homes, but you can also see that new housing starts, which are new builds, did not escalate. And population growth versus housing starts delay has been a very consistent trend in our research. Next, we're looking here at the lack of variety available in Toronto, where we mostly have single family homes and condos, whereas other places like Europe have much more variety and a really great mix of mid-sized developments, for example. And then next, we have a chart displaying housing prices. You can see that they're increasing, but hourly wage is staying fairly consistent. And then quickly, just an infographic here indicating that 90% of aspiring homeowners feel locked out of the Toronto housing market, and 68% is the portion of income that an average Toronto household would need to spend in order to cover ownership costs. And then this next section here at the bottom of our map is just designed to show some examples of the innovative and underused solutions that we looked at throughout our research. And underused solutions are solutions that exist, but that aren't used a lot, like purpose-built rentals. So in this graphic, we have some tiny homes on wheels, co-living arrangements, laneway houses, triplexes, and prefab home. And from here, I'll take you up to our iceberg diagram. And after narrowing the focus for this phase of our project, we revamped the iceberg model to explore the question of why, as a society, do we keep building this way? And we'll look quickly at events and trends. We were looking at things like affordable rental options being hard to find. We know that current housing in the GTA is tall and sprawl, which means that we have low density subdivisions and single family homes sprawling out from cities where high density condo towers are being built on small pieces of land in city centers. We know that new condos are being designed for investors, not families, and that low interest rates, which have been recently going up, but had been fueling the demand for single family homes. And as a result, we saw people driving to qualify. For underlying causes, the government is afraid to try new models, and they're underfunding non-market solutions. Building codes are rigid, and neighborhoods often have exclusionary zoning in place, which limits the development of multi-unit housing, therefore reducing the supply of available housing units. And this is also a practice that's historically rooted in racial discrimination. And then lastly, in this section, we looked at neighborhood associations, which are often tied to NIMBYism, which stands for Not in My Backyard. And these groups yield informal power to prevent change, which we'll talk about more a little bit later. At the bottom of the iceberg, we've got our world views, one of them being single family homes mean a higher quality of life, that renting is not secure, that real estate is a commodity, that disruption to the status quo causes uncertainty, and the idea that the character of a neighborhood should be preserved. Deep myths at the very bottom of the iceberg are housing prices will keep rising, families need to be raised in houses, and that building more houses will be the solution to fixing market affordability on its own. And then from here, we're going to take a quick look at our actors map. So we reduced and refined our original actors map that we developed at the start of this project to show just the key actors who are involved and impacted by housing innovation. If prioritized, housing innovations could offer additional options for prospective buyers. But as you can see at the bottom of the map, innovators of building and living models have very little power, and they rely on the municipal government to approve their approaches. Innovators have a conflicting relationship with neighborhood associations who often oppose new ideas and changes to the status quo. This is where we see some of that NIMBYism. And in fact, you'll see that neighborhood associations have a series of conflicting relationships on their own, but they also have some power over the municipal government. Our research indicated that many city councilors will submit to their residents over fear of losing votes. And then near the top of the map are large-scale developers who have knowledge, power, and influence, which has led to beneficial relationships with the provincial and municipal government, and influence over the Ontario Land Tribunal, who are brought in to resolve appeals on municipal land planning decisions. And now I will hand it over to Raphael to talk about our systemogram.
Thanks, Hannah. Excuse me. All right, so next I'm going to talk about the planning system with a focus on how informal power is exerted by the neighborhood associations over houses, how houses are built. So let me first set the stage. Next frame, please. So the province of Ontario sets the planning framework through the Planning Act and the provincial policy statement. They also set growth plans and the building code. It's up to municipalities to set and enforce the official plans with zoning and building standards and bylaws. Think of it as a bit like a chessboard. The province sets the squares and how many pieces, but it's up to municipalities to play the game. Next slide, please. So private industry, they'll obviously secure the land, prepare a development plan, and submit it for approval, but it's up to the municipalities to approve those plans based on their standards and bylaws. And that's the way the housing system works on paper, but when you begin to peel back the layers, there's a lot more informal dealings that complicate the process. Next. The planning department in Toronto is broken up by ward, and each councillor has a planners that work on developments in their ward. So before a developer submits the application, they'll have a pre-application consultation, and depending on the relationship with the councillor, they'll have a meeting to discuss whether the development will work with the ward. So even if they're not an anti-developer councillor, they'll still reflect the voice of their community, including the neighborhood associations, and they'll get developer to remove things that they perceive won't fly. So even before an application comes forward, it's been edited based on the perceived public opposition. There's also been instances where councillors will use the neighborhood associations to rile up opposition to developments, sometimes perhaps fairly, but in other cases not. They'll also vote in favor of something they oppose and get the councillor next to them that's not in their ward to vote against it, just to avoid the wrath of their neighborhood association. And councillors can also set multiple site conditions, request extra consultations, seek community benefits through things like childcare spaces in exchange for density bonuses. All of these things can be good individually, but they can also increase the complexity overall. So the planning system in Toronto is deeply impacted by change-adverse neighborhood associations, and to exert power over city councillors to protect their existing interests, as we said, not in my backyard. As one former Toronto executive said, most senior staff say it's broken, but nobody does anything about it because the council side, the NIMBYs rule the roost. An emerging group that we identified as a leverage point, the Yes in My Backyard groups, or YIMBY, they've begun to counter this powerful force by calling for the elimination of planning policies that restrict development. They are rooting their arguments based on equity and justice. Next, we'll just have a look at a bit of a process map, and we'll look at the steps that developers have to go through to get their development built in the city of Toronto. So first, they have to get the land and make a business case and get funding. All can take a long time on its own, with a lot of planning and money as well. So if a developer makes it through the successful application, consultation with the city, that's the pre-application, consultation, they have to then prepare a site plan, which can take up to 12 reports covering everything from the layout, boundaries, construction plan, floor plan, lights, landscape, soil, and more. Depending on the location and the type of development, they can ask for up to 22 studies that look at everything from archaeology, noise, parking, wind, stormwater, shade, heritage, tree preservation, and more. As a current city planner said, the majority of these studies are at the discretion of the planner, right? I think reasonably. And honestly, most planners just go tick, 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 and then just check them all. Now, if the site plan doesn't align with the zoning or the official plan, then the developer needs to apply for an amendment. And since the zoning in the downtown is almost all out of date, as we heard from a current city planner, almost everything has to go through a rezoning process, which can add multiple years to a project. Then there's the appeal process that can add more time on a development. The city can use this delay to extract concessions, while some developers use the pro-development bent of the Ontario Land Tribunal to bypass the city rules. They'll just wait it out and spend the money to get to where they need to go. So for innovators, the system is slow to change and adapt to new technology or ideas. So on top of the roadblocks for traditional players, innovators or non-market providers, small developers maybe that want to try to do something different, they have further barriers to do something. So as an innovator developer said, if I'm going to work within our policy, if I'm going to work within your policy, I can't be treated the same and put on some conveyor belt that takes me on the slow move. It's got to be fast. The guardians of the public interest in Toronto's planning department have taken a number of steps over the years to help solve problems and resident concerns. Small checks on the development process have ensured that there is adequate sunlight, minimized construction noise, trees are protected, heritage is preserved, character is maintained, and more. But the small checks have become a death by 1,000 cuts for innovators and smaller players. And only well-heeled big developers shopping large towers can make it through along small, narrow bands of density, while large stretches of the city's neighborhoods remain untouched. The process needs to change, but is hampered by city councilors backed by entrenched interests that are content with the status quo. The planning path to development hell is truly paved with good intentions. Thanks. Next, I'll pass to Hannah to talk a little bit about the experiences of fixes that fail.
Thanks, Raph. So as we just saw in the process map, the city does have good intentions to support solutions that could address the gap in housing options that are outside the status quo. And they even offer some incentives such as the Laneway Suites program. However, as Raphael explained, there's so much bureaucratic red tape and burdensome rules entrenched in the evaluation process that the municipality ends up getting in its own way and slowing down alternative options from seeing the light of day. And these slowdowns then leave the gap in our options widening and make the process feel punishing rather than rewarding to innovators. The result of that is that consumers aren't aware of other options aside from what we've always had. At the same time, our norms and values centered around homeownership push us into competing for the limited range of housing options we're left with. Bidding wars ensue where new buyers often lose out to those with incurred wealth, making hopeful buyers increasingly anxious about missing out on their chance at the homeownership dream. Thankfully, home buy incentives are available. At the same time, these incentives can sometimes heat up competition even further. Not only that, we saw from the low vacancy rates that competition is also fierce for limited rental options that feel viable and secure. This drives up rental prices, which become more and more comparable to monthly mortgage payments. Now, some renters look to join the home purchasing market in search of greater security, with a down payment becoming the only perceived barrier. As we heard from one renter, housing has never been a super permanent thing for me, but now it's something I'm desperate to get in on the housing market and looking at all different kinds of ways to do it. And so how could we help ourselves but fuel the fire? Okay, throughout the map, we've been hinting at a few major types of leverage points for intervention, so let's recap some of them. For the leverage point of rebalancing supply, our suggested interventions include ending exclusionary zoning to allow gentle density, such as fourplexes, and to revise inflexible standards around minimum parking and, setback requirements. We want to improve future population forecasts to properly reflect our growing community and enable faster development of affordable alternatives, and we'll speak a little more on that in a moment. At the same time, to help cool demand, we need to increase transparency in the purchasing process and eliminate things like blind bidding, end hidden ownership of land while mitigating speculation, and level the playing field between new buyers and those with intergenerational wealth. To improve the planning process, we need to make community consultations inclusive and reduce the power of NIMBYism, reform the overburdened approval process and rules to expedite innovative, smaller, and non-market solutions, and enable the Ontario Land Tribunal to accelerate land use planning while balancing community concerns. Finally, to boost innovation and non-market solutions, we need to increase various types of funding to build more alternative options, allow more flexible co-ownership models, develop innovative off-the-shelf design plans for repeatable, sustainable buildings for multifamily and accessible housing. So this means that homeowners or home builders can take advantage of these kinds of playbooks or kits when proposing new builds, which would help to speed up their process. We need to increase rental security through better protection of tenant rights and rent control, and also tap into things like experiential learning and pilot projects to increase people's familiarity and desire for innovative housing. So, as you can see, this is a wicked problem and there's no silver bullet. We hope to spark dialogue around these leverage points, so thank you for your time and we welcome your questions and feedback.
Thank you for that. Yeah, this is probably a very familiar problem to a lot of folks in the area, whether they're in Toronto or not. And so what are you seeing in the map, or what questions do you have for them? Thanks for the PDF too. Yeah. So I have a question with regard to how this might be viewed by some of the stakeholders themselves. I mean, do you think that, I don't remember what your access or experience would be, but given the story that can be told in the visualization itself, and that there's so much both, so much factual information and the relationships between everything from the different trade-offs and the systemic impact of the different housing, of the approach to housing through the in the Toronto neighborhoods. Is there a way that you might see that this could be presented in either a public meeting or as part of a discussion that could open this up further? I mean, what have you started to see since you worked on this yourselves?
I mean, that's a good question, Peter. I guess I'm going to take it and maybe go on a little journey, but just having had a provincial election where housing seemed to be really a top of mind issue in the run up to it, didn't really play that much of a role in the ultimate rollout of that election. I mean, I think ultimately there wasn't a lot of substantive policy discussion that, was anywhere on the map on the major issues of the crises that we're going through. But, you know, I just think the Yes in My Backyard groups, in the end, I don't think had that much of an impact, sort of having called them out as a bit of a leverage point. I mean, we heard it in our interviews, but then when it came time for the electorate to have their say, I guess it was just another very poignant and lesson that occurs pretty much every election, that you know, policy doesn't necessarily win you votes. It's a lot of authenticity and the ability of the leaders to radiate I don't know, whatever leadership qualities the electorate's looking for at the time. But so it just, you know, after taking a deep dive into this, kind of expected this to play a bit more of a role in the election, and it just really wasn't there at all. With affordability and housing being at the top of the kind of issue agenda. Yeah, just so I think in retrospect, looking at this now, is going back to your question about stakeholders. You know, how much ability does this sort of new group have to impact change? And I think the answer is maybe less than what I perhaps thought in the start.
Yeah, and perhaps it's also like, as I was talking about the very beginning, before the presentations, kind of the, you know, taking on any of these types of complex challenges can be a long-term effort too. And so you're not, you know, this is out of a particular analysis, out of a particular exercise, and it might not be, you know, the long-term, you know, the desired long-term fight for all of you. But there might be, you know, there might be really good stories to be told here also, in terms of influencing planners and people within the city. You know, that, so perhaps the, you know, the area of focus would be on those that you know, would be in a different, you know, would be in those that are supposed to be fighting for, you know, fighting for the the people in the different neighborhood regions of Toronto. I mean, so if the neighborhood associations are one mechanism for that, the councilors another, but also, you know, but the dynamics of that against developers are often, you know, you've described how that goes, and there's, you know, it's often, you know, the protectionism really does show up. But what about the planners and, you know, and those in the planning departments in the city that are having to negotiate all these different demands from, you know, from across the city and across the different participants?
I think one point to make, I don't know if it's the planners specifically, but that was quite striking with the interviews we did with city councilors. We spoke particular to one former city councilor, and I think if we were to show this map to Toronto City Council and say, you know, we need more innovation, these are some great solutions, here's some plans, I think that they would probably say, yeah, okay, that's great, but our constituents don't want this, for example. And it really seemed like I was shocked at the hold that a lot of these, you know, citizens have over their city councilors, and there's a really interesting tension and power dynamic there. So as wonderful as all these ideas are, I think that there are still people who would resist and councilors who are beholden to them. So I don't know how that shifts necessarily, if anyone else in my group wants to speak to it, but that was one of, for me, the most, one of the most striking tensions here.
I was sort of pondering about the idea of maybe like sharing this with my workplace, as in my employer's parent company. They do sit on the Toronto Housing Task Force, but if I can say sort of diplomatically, being a bank really most of their efforts, at least the ones that I can see, are geared towards how do we help people become homeowners? How do we help people change their individual behaviors to save up for long-term future goals, such as buying a home and then become homeowners, which benefits the company greatly as well. So I kind of thought about maybe like helping them see the bigger picture through something like this and this storytelling. I do wonder, with a little bit of like a healthy dose of skepticism, what their reaction will be, as in, will they tell me, oh, we know all this already, but the slice of the pie that we want to play in is X, which is driving up home ownership.
Mm.
The other anecdote I could share would be that I did show this to some current colleagues, and one's an engineer, worked in the developing industry, and she said, well, you should, like, first kids coming out of school, just joining the industry, should like read this as a starter and to like provide awareness. So some feedback was that, yeah, this could be helpful for what it's worth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what about people in, leaders in, well, see, real estate, the real estate industry, if you will, has its own, deeply embedded biases. So, even if they were, curious, they would probably also, reject the implications or the, the recommendations, because they want to hold on to the industry in a way that, that doesn't have any contest. It's kind of a ready-made industry for them. But so so some of this, and this is a little harder to show or to discuss, are the real power dynamics, which kind of, if you even expanded this a little further, if you drew, if you drew the systems that this is within, like the banking system, the real estate industry, the investment in the empty condos from BlackRock and those things, started to look at the intersection of larger scale power systems, well, then it becomes a little more controversial too. But then you can also like say, well, why is it stuck? And there's some very large elephants in the room.
Yeah, Peter, I am curious, like from your experience, when you've brought like very different stakeholders into one room, does that help to maybe create an environment of like forcing people to consider multiple perspectives rather than we play in X areas, so we're just focused on this?
Well, they have to want to be there or have to be invited. That's part of the thing. It can take, part of the process of developing, the opportunity and the context for multi-stakeholder engagement. So in some industries, like in healthcare, there's the presumption that the different players, though there may be power differentials, that they all generally have the same goals: to provide better healthcare services that are affordable at the cost that can be provided, and then can be developed through policies. And then a lot of it is just sorting out the different leaders and the roles and the service provision and the different focus of policy. And so some domains are more like that. This one's very, and housing is a problem because it's, the level of power behind, the financing and the decisions is much bigger than we can even in some ways imagine. It's so aggregated and so sedimented. And so they're, and they take it for granted, I think, too. So it's not, that's why I guess I would just ask the question, like, who would the best stakeholders be to invite the discussions for kind of better approaches that could contest the real estate business as usual? And could this be something that comes from enlightened planners in the city, because they would have the ability to bring kind of leading thinkers or speakers from around different areas of the industry to deal with a good question or problem solving approach. Like you could imagine a planning organization, or even one of the consulting firms setting up a webinar presentation with these different points of view that could be presented for, to enlighten the different players in the industry about new ideas and about where, and about concerns from the community members and thinkers of kind of the housing justice. And this isn't radical housing justice either. I mean, this isn't about providing homes for all. This is really about, it could be, but it's, that's kind of a different approach, that kind of radically changing the housing stock and providing housing justice.
Right.
Would be yet another perspective to bring. And this is one that really balances a lot of concerns and seems really reasonable. It would seem that banks would be interested in hearing about this even. So, I mean, it's some of this is kind of how you create the, if you will, the kind of conference or the hearing for something like this. Keeping it alive. I mean, you never know when, when you can kind of bend somebody's ear and suggest, that there, we might have something like a webinar presentation and, invite, 30 or 50 people of that, to something that might be a sponsored presentation of leading perspectives in housing and, Toronto's urbanization. And another thing that could really make the difference, it's like, what's the biggest leverage point? It's like a crisis. And, what happened in the stock market today? I mean, people have to be a little worried, that there are some things going on in finance markets right now that are going to have an effect on, on kind of the perceived stability in this, in this industry. It's perceived stable as long as interest rates, were low enough and credit was available and people were, what was the Scotiabank tagline that they took from Citibank? You're worth more, you're richer than you think. I mean, that's starting to end right now. So that's, sometimes the complexity in the environment itself is what we, want to start looking for and be prepared to kind of step in with a different narrative at a time when people really aren't sure what's going on, and they may be holding on to the old paradigm when things are clearly going to be changing over the next year or so, and it's going to have some long-term impacts. So that's the other thing is, is never let a good crisis go to waste if you're actually, if you're actually change makers in a particular area, in this domain, you can start to kind of set up your changing of perspective as, instead of an argument, it's kind of now a place of hopeful change in a direction that could be the new, the new direction going forward. And that could also be the connection between different maps too. So maybe a decentralized finance would have something to say about that, as I introduced kind of another topic. But yeah, are there any other questions? Just want to, say there are always, questions like this about the relevant stakeholders and how you might approach this map and who else might be, a particular map and how it might be engaged. And so that's part of what we look for, and depending on what you have access to in a particular industry or through other, other kind of thought leaders that you might know. It's, these are unique tools, and it's not hard to find people that will be interested in hearing the story. Not everyone will agree, of course.
Hey, Peter, it's Jennifer Marks. I don't know if you remember me from years ago with ISSS.
Oh yes, hi.
Yeah, and sorry, I don't.
Thanks for joining.
Yes, I can't get I might be able to get the video to work. I've got similar bandwidth problems, but great that David actually invites community to this. But I wanted to say, I agree with your original comment that you made when you were talking about the maps in general, that if you're invited in and you're working with a stakeholder group, it actually has a lot of power, basically. And what I notice is when I listened to some student presentations from Derek Cabrera's lab, and I noticed that some of those students actually ended up going and working. They might already be working in environments that touch on the system that they've been modeling. So I think that some individuals in this group might work close to or be interested in, you know, pursuing careers in this. But I was thinking when you were talking about the conversation of what do you do with this and how do you change things, that it seems to me that I love the ideas that you shared, but you need stakeholders that will lead the charge, basically. And I was thinking about, you know, sometimes an entrepreneur has an interest in an area, you know, a leading entrepreneur who's got sort of influence, and maybe social capital. When you're talking about the banking industries, I think we've seen social capital organizations drive investment and more sustainable energy and more sustainable investment sort of strategies in general. And then that idea of a collaborative of stakeholders, like if you think about having progressive people, having the building industry present. And then I think another way to sort of drive change is to do it in direct communities, like not try to do it for all of the city, for example, but find specific segments of the city that might be more interested in driving it.
Yeah, thank you for those, those comments and observations. And just any responses from the team? Jennifer's remarks.
Well, I am currently working in and around housing. Actually, this year I started doing government relations for Passive House Canada, and then my summer placement is working for building a circular economy in Guelph around construction, renovation, and demolition waste. So somehow maybe unrelated and just lucky, but it all kind of came together. So this has been a year of housing for me. But otherwise, yeah.
Yeah, I think it was I really love your work. It's very, very in-depth and well thought out. And it made me think about, you know, I'm in San Francisco, so in the US, there are many entities that have tried to do this, and many homeowners, you know, home builders, for example, that are still struggling basically for much the same reasons. So it's an important quest.
Yeah, you know, and of course, a map like this can be the starting point. I mean, so this was actually done as coursework, and of course, with further research or the, you know, this and engagement, this could be extended, and that can be one of the other ways in. So we've got about half an hour for each group, and so I'd like to move to the decentralized finance presentation. I'll go ahead and